What's gaming, gamers? Today, I've got a hunter build for you using the exotic arms Young Ahamkara's Spine. This Red War exotic has an incredibly fun ability spam loop, and with Guardian Games now in full swing, it's even better in the Guardian Games playlist with its increase to ability energy regeneration. Now, I'll describe what Young Ahamkara's Spine and its perk, Wish Dragon Teeth, do. Firstly, Young Ahamkara's Spine intrinsically grants you the Fastball Arms mod for every grenade without having to slot it. Fastball will make grenades thrown travel 25% faster to their destination, which effectively means you can throw grenades 25% further. This effect varies slightly depending on the grenade, but it's not significant enough to be important. Next, Young Ahamkara's Spine increases the efficacy of Tripmine grenades heavily. Tripmine grenades will deal 14% more damage, as well as getting an increase to their damage radius by 81%. It also removes the damage falloff of the Tripmine grenade, meaning any enemy caught within its 14 square meter radius will take the full damage of the grenade. Furthermore, Young Ahamkara's Spine removes the self-damage properties of the Tripmine grenade, allowing you to be within its damage radius and still take no damage. For its ability spam properties, any instance of solar ability damage will refund you 33% of your grenade ability's energy. In the case of the Tripmine grenade and the Knife Trick melee ability, if the target survives being hit by either of those two abilities, you will be granted 66% of your grenade's energy instead of the base 33%. This makes this build great for both ad clearing and boss damage or champ busting, as you get more refunded energy if the enemy you're using your abilities on has enough health to survive. Now that you know what Young Ahamkara's Spine does, I'm going to do a subclass setup to go along with it. I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup, if that's what you prefer, and then go into detail about what each choice does, as well as alternatives should there be any. Run the Blade Barrage Super, the Gambler's Dodge, whichever jump you prefer, the Knife Trick melee ability, the Tripmine grenade, the Knock 'em Down aspect, the On Your Mark aspect, Ember of Ashes, Ember of Resolve, Ember of Searing, Ember of Singeing, and Ember of Torches. To detail the subclass, for the Super, you can really run whichever one you want. The Golden Guns will be getting a boost to their damage in PvE come Season 21, but for right now, I'm of the opinion that Blade Barrage is the better super, so I use that. For the Dodge, Gambler's Dodge will be the best option. As Young Ahamkara's Spine only grants you grenade energy, Gambler's Dodge will work to instantly refund your melee ability's energy, letting you continue the loop with your grenade faster than you could with either Marksman's or Acrobat's Dodge. For the melee ability, Knife Trick is the best one, as it synergizes twice as well with Young Ahamkara's Spine as any of the other melee abilities. Additionally, it has the shortest cooldown, which means it'll recharge the fastest if you miss your Gambler's Dodge. Knife Trick will also scorch targets upon hit, with it applying 20 scorch stacks without Ember of Ashes and 30 scorch stacks with it. For your grenade, Tripmine will be the best, as its effectiveness is significantly increased by the Young Ahamkara's Spine arms, as well as refunding the most energy upon damaging a target with it. When the Tripmine grenade explodes, it will apply 40 scorch without Ember of Ashes and 60 scorch with Ember of Ashes equipped. During Season 20, you could use the Firebolt grenade along with the Rain of Firebolts artifact mod, but I'll talk more about the artifact and that combination later in the video. Onto the aspects, firstly, Knock 'em Down. This one is very helpful for this build specifically, as it allows melee kills while radiant to fully refund your melee ability. It also increases the potency of all three supers, but that's less important than the melee ability fully refunding on kills while radiant. That allows you to use your Knife Trick more freely on ads, as you'll still get 33% refunded grenade energy when you kill an ad with the Knife Trick. Knock 'em Down also grants you 2 fragment slots, which will help with the subclass build as a whole. For the second aspect, On Your Mark is chosen mostly for its 3 fragment slots. The increase to reload speed and handling is nice, and with this build taking advantage of the Gambler's Dodge almost on cooldown, you'll be nearly constantly at 3 stacks of On Your Mark. But its main draw is the 3 fragment slots, of which full advantage will be taken. To get into those fragments, firstly, I'll mention that there are more than 5 fragments that can work with this build. I'll describe the 5 I've chosen for myself first, and then go over the others that would work as well. Firstly, Ember of Ashes. Ember of Ashes will increase the amount of scorch stacks applied to targets by 50% rounded up, which means you'll be igniting enemies more often, as well as having enemies scorched for longer, as scorch stacks decay at a constant rate. The next fragment is Ember of Resolve. Ember of Resolve will grant you the Cure buff upon defeating targets with your grenade, with 1 stack of Cure instantly granting you 60 HP. If you defeat more than 1 target with a grenade, you'll be granted Cure for every target killed. It isn't limited to 1 burst of Cure per grenade throw. Ember of Resolve will help you stay alive in higher difficulty content, as enemies hit hard and miss less when you're in close proximity to them, and this build essentially requires you to be nearby enemies all the time. The third fragment is Ember of Searing. Ember of Searing will grant you a differing amount of melee ability energy upon defeating any scorched target, depending on the tier of the target killed. Additionally, upon defeating a scorched target, a Fire Sprite will be created, which will grant you 12.5% grenade ability energy upon picking it up. Fire Sprites do have a 5-second cooldown between creations, but they're helpful as a boost to your grenade's energy if you find yourself needing it. Ember of Searing is mostly brought for its melee ability energy gains, but it also grants you 10 points to your recovery stat, which is a good stat to have to boost your health regeneration. The fourth fragment is Ember of Singeing. Ember of Singeing will grant a 300% boost to your class ability's recharge rate for 3 seconds upon applying Scorch to an enemy. Unfortunately, Ember of Singeing won't proc if you kill the enemy with an attack that would have scorched them, for example killing an enemy with the knife trick melee, but it does reset to its 3-second duration every time Scorch is applied to an enemy. This can make it advantageous to be killing both low health red bar adds as well as higher threat orange health enemies or champions, as you'll almost constantly have the extra 300% class ability recharge rate. Lastly, for fragments I use is Ember of Torches. Ember of Torches will make you radiant for 8 seconds upon damaging an enemy with your powered melee attack, which feeds into the knock 'em down aspect. Knock 'em down fully refunds your melee ability upon getting a kill with your powered melee ability while radiant. Importantly, if you aren't radiant and you kill an enemy with your knife throw, it will still refund you the full melee ability energy because it counts that as you having become radiant before the enemy dies. Lastly, Ember of Torches comes with a -10 stat point penalty to your discipline stat, so keep that in mind when putting together your armor build. Now, for fragments I don't personally use, but you could if you prefer them, I'll start with Ember of Char. Ember of Char will apply Scorch to any enemy damaged by an ignition, with it applying 40 Scorch without Ember of Ashes and 60 Scorch with Ember of Ashes. Ember of Char works well with this build, as you'll be igniting enemies constantly, and with those ignitions spreading Scorch to nearby enemies, you'll be able to chain ignitions very easily. Additionally, Ember of Char comes with a +10 stat boost to your discipline stat, which, as I've said, isn't exactly required for this build, but could come in handy if you find yourself without any abilities. Lastly, for alternative fragments, you could run Ember of Solace. This will increase the duration of Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you by 50%, meaning when you become Radiant via Ember of Torches, you'll become Radiant for 12 seconds instead of 8. This is mostly beneficial for staying Radiant during boss damage phases, as Radiant grants your weapons a 25% boost to outgoing damage. As this build has you throwing your melee ability constantly, as long as you hit an enemy with it, you'll constantly refresh your Radiant buff to its max, leaving this as a niche pick for specific scenarios wherein you'd like to maximize your weapon damage for a longer period of time when you wouldn't otherwise be able to refresh Radiant. Any combination of the 7 fragments I've just mentioned will do well with this build, so play around with different permutations and see which one works best for you. With the subclass build done, I'll go into the artifact setup if you're watching this video during Season 20, the Season of Defiance. On screen, you're seeing the setup I use when running this build, and I'll highlight the important mods now. In the first column, run whichever anti-champion mods you need for the activity you'll be entering. The Radiant effect does grant anti-barrier rounds to weapons that don't already have anti-champion capabilities, so you can get away with not running any anti-barrier weapon mods, but I'm usually running one just to be sure I can pop a barrier shield if I can't proc Radiant. In the second column, run the authorized mods for solar weapons and grenades. These mods will decrease the cost of any armor mods affecting both your solar weapons and grenades to a cost of 1 energy, which will allow you to slot more mods into your armor. In the third column, first run the Shatter Orbs mod. Shatter Orbs will cause an orb of power to be summoned upon the destruction of a combatant shield with a damage type that corresponds with that shield's energy. Shatter Orbs only works the first time you destroy an enemy's shield, so you can't infinitely farm orbs off of shielded combatants, but it's still a really useful increase to your orb of power generation. Next, in the third column, run the Solar Surge mod. This mod will grant you 1 stack of armor charge upon collecting a fire sprite, and if you're running the Ember of Searing fragment, you'll be creating fire sprites constantly. Solar Surge will work to increase the uptime of your armor charge stacks, which will benefit this build later with ability energy refunds. There aren't any perks in the fourth column that specifically synergize with the build as I've laid it out thus far, so I'll skip to the fifth column. In the fifth column, grab the Prismatic Transfer mod. Prismatic Transfer will grant your allies a 20% boost to outgoing weapon damage upon the casting of your super, so long as their subclass element differs from yours. The damage boost granted by Prismatic Transfer doesn't stack with other damage boosts like Radiant or Weapons of Light, but if neither of those boosts are active, Prismatic Transfer is a good passive buff to your teammates' damage output. Lastly, I'll talk about the 2 Firebolt grenade mods, Flare Up and Rain of Firebolts. Flare Up will cause your Firebolt grenades to apply an additional 30 Scorch stacks, with this additional boost not being affected by Ember of Ashes. By default, Firebolt grenades will apply 20 Scorch stacks without Ember of Ashes and 30 Scorch stacks with Ember of Ashes, meaning Flare Up increases that to 50 and 60 stacks of Scorch if you either don't or do have Ember of Ashes equipped respectively. Furthermore, Flare Up causes your Firebolts to summon a Fire Sprite upon damaging a target, which will grant you 12.5% grenade ability energy upon being picked up. Fire Sprites have a 5-second cooldown that is shared between all sources of creating Fire Sprites, including Ember of Searing, so Flare Up would lower that fragment's efficacy slightly. Next, the Rain of Fire mod will simply grant you a second Firebolt grenade. If you were to use those 2 mods and run the Firebolt grenade instead of the Tripmine grenade, you'd only be refunded 33% grenade energy upon dealing damage with your grenades, whether the enemy survives or not. Importantly, the Knife Trick melee ability will still grant you 66% grenade ability energy upon dealing damage with it if the enemy survives, meaning having the Firebolts equipped would increase your overall ability spam capabilities. During the Season of Defiance, the Firebolt grenades would probably be the best option, but I wanted this video to be more of an overall build and less of a season-specific build, which is why I'm only mentioning the Firebolts now. With the artifact out of the way, I can get into the armor setup for this build. Firstly, I'll go over stat distribution. In the top 3 stack grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Mobility and Resilience evenly. This unfortunately means you'll have to sacrifice your recovery stat a little bit depending on the armor you have. Mobility is important for your class ability's regeneration, as this build uses Gambler's Dodge to refund the melee ability if it doesn't refund itself by missing the throw or not killing the enemy hit by the melee. Resilience is just as good a stat to have, as every tier of Resilience will grant you an additive 3% damage resistance to all incoming damage up to a maximum of 30% at tier 10 Resilience. Recovery is also a good stat, as it dictates the delay before your health starts to regenerate after having taken damage, as well as the rate at which you regenerate your health. However, for this build, Mobility and Resilience are more important, so Recovery will have to suffer slightly. In the bottom 3 stack grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, you really aren't in need of any of the 3 of them specifically. Spec into Strength and Discipline evenly, with your choice of which to prioritize being entirely up to you. Intellect is a stat I recommend ignoring, as your super's uptime isn't as important as your melee ability and grenades uptimes. My build has me at 81 Mobility, 81 Resilience, 53 Recovery, 70 Discipline, 30 Intellect, and 61 Strength. Onto the Armor's mods, I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup and then get into detail about what each mod does, as well as alternative options should there be any. On your helmet, run an Ashes to Assets mod, a Hands-On mod, and a Harmonic Siphon mod. On your arms, run a Firepower mod, a Focusing Strike mod, and a Heavy-Handed mod. On your chest piece, run a Charged Up mod and 2 of whatever resistance mods you require. On your legs, run a Better Already mod, an Invigoration mod, and a Recuperation mod. On your cloak, run 2 Utility Kickstart mods and a Bomber mod. To detail the Armor's mods, I'll start in your helmet. The Ashes to Assets mod will grant you increased super gains upon gaining kills with your grenade. The next mod, Hands On, will increase the amount of super energy gained upon getting kills with your melee ability. As this build uses both the grenade and melee ability back to back constantly, these mods will be helpful to increase your super's uptime, which in turn increases the total damage output of the build. Lastly, the Harmonic Siphon mod will summon an Orb of Power upon getting a multi-kill with any solar weapon, which, upon collection, will grant you both super energy and armor charge. If you're watching during the Season of Defiance and you're running the Authorized Grenades Artifact mod, you can swap out the Harmonic Siphon for a second Ashes to Assets mod if you so choose. Doing so will lower the utility of your solar weapons and your armor charge uptime, but the increased super gains from grenade kills would be a compromise you'd have to try out to see if it works for you. Onto the arms mods, firstly the Firepower mod. Firepower will summon an Orb of Power upon getting a kill with your grenade on a 1-second cooldown. This 1-second cooldown means that even if your grenade kills more than one enemy in its explosion, it will still only summon one Orb of Power. The orb summoned by Firepower is used for its super energy gains, stacks of armor charge, and ability energy later on. The next mod, Hands On, will summon an Orb of Power upon getting a kill with your powered melee ability. Hands On also has a 1-second cooldown between orb generations, but its cooldown is separate from that of Firepower. The orb summoned by Hands On will work to provide the same benefits as the one summoned by Firepower, which are super energy, armor charge, and ability energy. Lastly, on your arms, the Focusing Strike mod will grant you 20% class ability energy upon dealing damage with your melee attack. Focusing Strike doesn't require you to use your powered melee ability, so you could attack something with your unpowered melee and still be provided the class ability energy, but it does have a hidden 7-second cooldown between activations. Focusing Strike works to increase the uptime of your Gambler's Dodge, which is a very important ability to have charged in case you miss your knife trick throw or are throwing your knife at an enemy who won't die to it. For the chest piece, the Charged Up mod will simply increase your maximum stacks of armor charge from 3 stacks to 4 stacks. This will come in handy later, as the utility kickstart mods on the cloak will take advantage of armor charge. As for the resistance mods, it doesn't matter which one you run, so think about the activity you'll be going into and apply the mods that will best protect you from the most threatening damage source present in that activity. Onto the legs, first the Better Already mod. Better Already will instantly start health regeneration upon the collection of an Orb of Power, which is helpful for this build as the recovery stat is lower due to the focusing of mobility and resilience. The second mod, Invigoration, will grant you 10% melee ability energy upon the collection of an Orb of Power. This will do well to help quickly recharge your melee ability should you need it, as the Harmonic Siphon in your helmet will generate orbs for you upon getting multi-kills with your solar weapons. Lastly, the Recuperation mod will instantly heal you for 70 health upon the collection of an Orb of Power, which is actually more health than the cure buff provided by the Ember of Resolve fragment. Better Already, Recuperation, and Ember of Resolve all work to keep you alive while you're in close proximity to multiple enemies, as that's an incredibly dangerous area to be with no healing capabilities like you'd get from the Lorelei Splendor Titan helmet or a healing rift cast by a Warlock. For the cloak, the 2 utility kickstart mods will work to instantly refund you class ability energy upon the use of your class ability. These will grant you more energy based on the amount of stacks of armor charge you have, which is one reason why orb generation is such a big part of this build. With no stacks of armor charge and 2 utility kickstart mods slotted, you'll be refunded 16.7% of your class ability's energy upon the use of your class ability. As this build uses 1 charged up mod, with the 2 utility kickstart mods and 4 stacks of armor charge, you'll be refunded 41.2% of your class ability's energy instantly upon the use of your class ability. This is incredibly helpful for nullifying the extra 9-second cooldown Gambler's Dodge comes with versus its counterpart of Marksman's Dodge. Lastly, the Bomber mod will grant you 10% of your grenade's energy upon the use of your class ability. This, admittedly, isn't entirely necessary, but it's the only 1 energy cost mod I can think of to be useful for this build. With the armor build out of the way, I'll now get into some weapon recommendations I have for use with this build. I'll first describe a couple of legendary weapons, and once I've gone over those, I'll get into some exotic weapons that synergize well with this build. Firstly for weapons is the Callus Mini-Tool submachine gun that was available during the Season of the Haunted. This weapon is unfortunately no longer acquirable, but I'm hopeful Bungie will make past season weapons patterns available to players who didn't acquire those patterns at the time. As this weapon currently isn't acquirable, if you have its pattern, I recommend the role of Threat Detector and Incandescent. Threat Detector will increase the weapon's stability, reload speed, and handling when within close proximity of 2 or more enemies, with its buff being significantly stronger when near 3 or more enemies. This perk synergizes perfectly with this build, as you'll be constantly near enemies to proc Threat Detector's buffs. Incandescent, on the other hand, will cause enemies who die to final blows by the weapon to explode, causing any nearby enemies to be scorched. Scorched enemies will proc both the Ember of Searing and Ember of Singeing fragments, which will cause fire sprites to be summoned upon the death of those scorched enemies, as well as granting you a 300% increase to your class ability's regeneration rate when Scorch is applied to an enemy. Next for weapons, one that is currently acquirable is the Strident Whistle Bow from the Vanguard Ops playlist. This weapon is focusable at Zavala in the tower if you have it in your collections, making it fairly easy to farm for. In its third column, perks I'd recommend you hunt for are Archer's Tempo and Perpetual Motion, with Moving Target being a perk I wouldn't specifically hunt to roll for, but also wouldn't dismantle. In its fourth column, the perk you want is Incandescent. Incandescent, as I've said, will synergize heavily with this build, thus it's a perk you want to hunt for if you're wanting to use Strident Whistle with this build. Lastly for energy weapons is the Zali's Bane hand cannon from the Golgoroth, Daughters, and Oryx encounters in the Kingsfall raid. This hand cannon is a lot of fun to use, especially with the recent 20% buff to the damage of hand cannons. This weapon is craftable, and the role I use with it is Explosive Payload in its third column and Incandescent in its fourth column. For heavy weapons, there's a couple that would synergize well with this build. Firstly, the Avalanche machine gun from the Dawning event. This gun isn't currently acquirable, but if you played during last year's Dawning, or are watching this video during this year's Dawning, it's a really fun machine gun to use. In its third column, I recommend either Ambitious Assassin or Subsistence. In its fourth column, Incandescent is the perk to pick for this build, but Adrenaline Junkie wouldn't be a terrible pick either. Next is the Cry Mutiny Heavy Grenade Launcher that was the Ritual playlist weapon during Season 18, the Season of Plunder. If you didn't get this weapon during the Season of Plunder, you can purchase it from the Monument to Lost Lights in the tower under the Legacy Gear section. Cry Mutiny has both Incandescent and Demolitionist in its third column, with Swashbuckler and Vorpal Weapon in its fourth column. Incandescent and Swashbuckler would be the two perks to choose for this build specifically, as this build would take advantage of both the Scorch caused by Incandescent and the extra damage granted by Swashbuckler. Lastly for heavy weapons is the Fixed Odds Machine Gun, which is craftable and is acquirable from the Keitel encounter in the Duality Dungeon. This high-impact frame machine gun is a lot of fun to use, and I enjoy it thoroughly. In its third column, Feeding Frenzy would be the best perk, but Field Prep would be a reasonable alternative if you don't have the weapon crafted. In its fourth column, Incandescent would synergize the best with this build, and most solar builds, but Rampage would work well for increasing the weapon's damage output. For exotic weapons, there are a bunch that synergize with Solar 3.0 and apply Scorch in their own way. Exotic energy weapons that apply Scorch are the Jotun Fusion Rifle with its Catalyst, the Polaris Lance Scout Rifle, the Prometheus Lens Trace Rifle, the Skyburner's Oath Scout Rifle, and the Sunshot Hand Cannon. Exotic heavy weapons that apply Scorch are the 1000 Voices Fusion Rifle and the Two-Tailed Fox Rocket Launcher. With everything else out of the way, I'll describe the loop that will let you chain abilities constantly. Firstly, throw your Tripmine grenade. If whatever you threw it at dies, you'll get 33% of your grenade's energy refunded, and if they survive, you'll get 66% of your grenade's energy back. Once your grenade is thrown, throw your knife trick melee and fully refund your grenade's energy. If whatever you threw your knife at died, your knife will be fully recharged. If it didn't die, use your Gambler's Dodge next to that enemy to refund yourself your melee ability. Then start over. Your dodge will recharge itself over time, especially with your continuous scorching of enemies, and should be recharged by the next time you need it. Pick up Orbs of Power whenever they drop to heal yourself, get kills with your grenades to proc Ember of Resolve and grant yourself Cure, and continue the loop from there. It's a super simple loop to both get started and keep going, which makes it super fun in almost any level of activity. But that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, have any feedback, or would like to see more videos like this, leave a like, comment, or subscribe. Anything helps, even just your view, so I appreciate you taking the time. If you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, I've left a link to both the Bungie website and the Discord server in the description below. Check those out if that interests you. Again, thanks for watching and have a great day.